Hello, welcome to Balance of Power. I'm Annalise Klingbeil.
I'm Leah Ward.
And today Shannon is on the road, but fret not, we have a guest on the pod. We are very pleased to welcome Dr. Bronwyn Bragg. She's a human geographer and professor in the Department of Geography and Environment at the University of Lethbridge, an expert on labor immigration and the impacts of precarious work on families and communities.
Hi, so excited to be here.
Glad to have you, Bronwyn. You've done recent work on the temporary foreign worker program, meatpacking industry, including the one in Brooks, which is Danielle Smith's own riding. So we're excited to have you here today to help us dig into these referendum questions and help sort some fact from fiction.
We're going to yell today.
We're gonna yell. We're gonna yell about immigration in Alberta.
Bronwyn, welcome. Welcome to Balance of Power. Thanks for taking the time to chat. We're going to focus on the Alberta referendum set to run on October 19th, 2026. In the Premier's address to the province, she blamed Canada's immigration policies and the influx of temporary foreign workers into the province for Alberta's overextended healthcare and education systems. We will dispute maybe some mis- and disinformation flying around, including what's been put forward by our own Premier.
But first, Danielle Smith's announcement of the referendum, we've seen, since then, a little bit of backlash. So first of all, there's the outrageous cost. $20 million was allocated in the budget for these referendum questions, which, I mean, there's there's 20 million places that money could go. Hundreds of nurses, teachers, educational assistants, early childhood educators, long-term care workers, that hundreds of staffing positions could be funded with that 20 million. So that's, off the top, that's pretty offensive. But we're also getting more reaction out of different stakeholders. So the Assembly of Treaty Chiefs and Grand Chief McCurdy said that the potential referendum was the quote-unquote last straw for First Nations, losing faith in this government. And of course, there are migrant and immigrant and refugee groups that, Bronwyn, I'm sure you'll be able to tell us about how the fallout has been in those communities.
Bronwyn, to start, why don't you tell us were you watching the address 2 weeks ago, or did you kind of consume it after? And what were your thoughts when you first heard Smith's address and her framing of the referendum questions?
I'll be candid. I saw the sort of pre-announcement that this was coming, that she was going to do an address that was focused on immigration. And I decided for my mental and cardiac health to not watch the address live. But then I did watch it following, and then I followed up with her press conference the next day. And I guess my first impression, and I think, it was fairly clearly telegraphed in what she said she was going to talk about, was just the real harm that this kind of rhetoric has on in communities. And I don't mean communities like immigrant communities, I mean across Alberta society. And I think we are living in a really dangerous time. And we know immigration levels or support for immigration across the country has just pretty much collapsed. So she's pushing on an open door, right? this across, political affiliation, across geography, urban, rural, wherever we go, attitudes toward immigration have declined year over year for the last 5 years and over the last 10 years. So, 60% of Canadians think there's too many immigrants. So to take that and give that to kind of one of the most politically powerful people in the province and have her put out a bunch of information that is at best inaccurate and at worst, again, potentially quite dangerous, is going to have real impact. It's going to affect kids who are going to school, who are hearing this messaging and rhetoric. Most people, I don't think, consume a lot of news and good news, good information. And also our immigration system is super, super complicated. And that's something we should critique, and we should talk about, and we should unpack. But for the average news consumer, this logic that she's promoting may make sense to people. And I think that that's very dangerous, because blaming the many social and economic challenges that we're facing as a province on a minority population is just going to be, the consequences are not going to be good for those folks. And in the long run, I don't think they're going to be beneficial to all of us in Alberta.
So you kind of watched it after the fact. It's been a couple weeks. Have you heard, what have you heard in the past couple weeks, and what are you kind of focusing on now when it comes to thoughts on this?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think, the cumulative effect of the referendum questions, because then, you look at the questions, right? You get into the questions, like, what are we talking about here? And I know we might do that in a bit more detail, but the basic cumulative effect of these 5 immigration questions is to give the impression that there is a large number of temporary residents in the province who are effectively sucking up all of our healthcare and education dollars, and other social service programs, presumably Alberta Works or social supports. And that is just there is no empirical basis for that claim, right? There's not one claim that she's making, but the effect of those 5 proposals is to lead people to believe that the reason I wait 12 hours for my little kid to get checked in the ER is because of those newcomer families that are here, or the reason my kid's class is chaotic is because there's too many immigrants. And so I think as the kind of, I guess as it's settled down a bit and as people have kind of started to look at what these questions mean, I'm seeing and hearing there are a number of different, communities and groups who are figuring out how to respond. But I think the challenge is always there are some amazing grassroots organizations that are not funded by government. I'm thinking of the International Migrants Alliance. They came out with a big statement yesterday opposing the referendum. And I personally believe that is the position that we need to be taking, because there's no really good questions here to actually, vote on. But other groups have been, I think, a bit more cautious. There is organizing happening and people are having these conversations, but out the gate, organizations and groups are a bit more cautious because it's a very complicated politics for community organizations to go right up to dispute the claims of the premier, right? Which is effectively what needs to happen to, I think, unpack what is happening in these questions.
This is one of the things that worries me so much, and I'm wondering if how you might see this showing up in your work. But you have the Premier of Alberta articulating disinformation. Then it has its own trajectory, right? So the people for whom that is meant will hear it. It'll generate memes and social media discussions and chat groups, and it'll take on a life of its own. And the folks who are opposing it will be on their own train, talking to their own people, refuting the facts, clarifying the distinction between a refugee and an asylum seeker and a temporary foreign worker. Neither of these groups of people are talking to each other. What happens then? What do you see with dynamics like that?
Yeah, this is the world that I swim in the sense of we can fact check these referendum questions till the cows come home. Sorry for the Alberta metaphor.
They're bogus.
But and we can talk about these differences. We can talk about how temporary resident numbers are down. We can talk about how not permanent resident numbers are down. We can talk about how actually we need more immigration, not less, but we should do it better. We can talk about how exploitive the temporary foreign worker program is and how we should critique it. But we can do all of that. But at the end of the day, and I know a previous guest has said this on this podcast, when people's feelings, and this is where immigration is both this very nerdy, very policy wonky, very complicated topic that, is very hard even for specialists to really understand because it's ever changing and et cetera. But it's a feelings thing, right? So for people that are frustrated by the economy, by the cost of living, by a housing crisis, and as a professor, I see these kids, these young people, I call them kids, they're not children, but they're in their early 20s and they're worried, right? They're scared about their future, their prospects, their so forth. And so to be well, actually your experience of the economy or of the housing market is not actually the fault of these other people. And we, in fact, need many of these other people to come in because we have like chronic labor shortages and wage shortages specifically across specific industries, is not like, okay, your facts don't really make my feelings better. And so I think this is where, like, I think at a political level, we need like the political leadership to be offering like really tangible like not solutions, but like really clear explanations. Like wages are down for most workers, wages have like incrementally gone up, but housing prices have gone up by like 400%. So it's pretty crummy out there. And this is like an opportunity to kind of like say we haven't solved any of these actual problems that you're facing as an Albertan or as a Canadian. But here's a group of people you can blame. And all those folks that want to buy that are going to be on their Facebook and on their TikTok and on their neighborhood group chats or whatever. And that validates their priors. And it's a simple solution. And I agree. But I don't think it can be left to like community organizations, migrant rights groups, or like, because again, most of the folks I work with are like low wage workers with like time poverty as well as like financial stresses. Like, is it really on them to kind of like explain their like, they are taxpayers who pay into our EI, but can never really claim it. Like, it's not their responsibility. So we need there needs to be a political leadership response to this that like is fact-based, but actually really, I think more importantly, addresses the feelings that are driving the high levels of anti-immigrant sentiment that we have, which have to be like, go back to kind of some level of like economic analysis. And not talk facts at people, because I do that. And like, it just like facts are very important, but they're not good. They're not a political solution. So it can't be the responsibility of just like academics to try and like be like, but actually my but actuallys don't actually really change much. We need politics to step in here and push back against this.
Yeah, it's not common when I talk to experts and professors specifically that I hear them say that facts are not the answer. So usually that's my rant. I think you're absolutely right. So I'm thinking about like what does an economic argument or maybe a more local political leader, let's say in Brooks, do? I mean, what happens in Brooks without an immigrant workforce?
Take a step back there for a sec, Bronwyn. Like, can you tell, I know you've done a lot of work in Brooks. Talk about kind of that in general, and then I'm sure that'll lead to an answer to Leah's question.
Sure. So Brooks is like, okay, this is where it's very nerdy. In my opinion, Brooks is one of the most interesting places in the world because you have this town of like 15,000 people, outside, like 2 hours from Calgary, 2 hours from Lethbridge. For those of you not in Alberta, like in a very like remote corner of the province, and its population has just changed dramatically. So in the last like 20 years, it's grown enormously from like about 10,000 people to 15,000 people. And most of that growth has come from international and also interprovincial migration. But the reason people are attracted to this like relatively small community that is far from large urban centers is because there are employment opportunities at the huge meatpacking plant, the beef packing plant on the outskirts of town. And that plant has been there since like the 1970s. I'll spare everybody the history, though it's fascinating. But suffice to say, all of this international migration, as well as interprovincial migration and by interprovincial, I do mean the movement of international immigrants who maybe land in like an Ontario or BC, and then they move to Alberta. So they are both international and interprovincial migrants who have come and who work at the meatpacking plant. And that plant used to be Canadian owned, as was typical of our entire beef industry. These are Canadian packers. And over the last, 3 decades, the industry has become like heavily consolidated and is now foreign owned. So the plant in Brooks is run by a Brazilian transnational corporation. And the other big beef packing plant is in High River, just outside of Calgary, also has become much more of a transnational, a highly diverse international community. because of the Cargill meatpacking plant. And for folks may remember that during the COVID-19 pandemic, both of these plants were really hard hit by COVID early on. And Cargill itself became the site of the largest COVID-19 outbreak connected to a workplace in North America at the time. And meatpacking workers, immigrant workers who work in meatpacking died. Okay, they died in this industry at that time. And so my work has been with migrant, immigrant, refugee workers. So a whole bunch of different people who come through different programs, including temporary foreign workers in High River and in Brooks. Now back to Brooks. So Brooks again is in the current premier's riding. And it is this mix of, on the one hand, kind of old, white settler ranching background on the one, because it's a sort of oil and gas agriculture hub, and that with the meatpacking plant has now become much more transnational. So the immigrant population of Brooks is 36% higher than Calgary, comparable with some of our larger cities. And the visible minority population, or the non-white population, non-Aboriginal, non-Indigenous, immigrant or non-white, is 50%. So you go to this place and you're in the middle of the prairies, and then you're walking, you've seen women with hijabs. There's a large Muslim population, but there's also, so we have resettled refugees who are coming from East Africa is a big part of the workforce. And then a huge number of temporary foreign workers who are coming from historically Philippines, China, or Philippines, Mexico, Central America, and so forth. And it creates and it's a very interesting place because this is a highly diverse place. Brooks, in some ways, is a multicultural success story in the sense of you have these super diverse schools, amazing teachers, amazing, you just meet amazing people in Brooks who are really at the front line of the social change that is produced through immigration. And it's a positive story. Also for longtime Brooks residents, it's their housing prices, their housing values are way up. There is a housing shortage, which is a real tension and problem. But as opposed to other small rural communities, which have faced population decline and economic decline as a result, Brooks is totally counter to all of that. At the same time, those 50% of the population that are racialized are also lower income because they are earning not quite poverty wages, but very low wages working in meatpacking. And the work in meatpacking, which has been the focus of my work, has been on the conditions that they face. And especially for these temporary foreign workers who, just to be very clear, pay taxes and pay into our EI system.
And when just repeat that again.
Yeah. So the temporary foreign workers, these non-permanent residents in Alberta, pay taxes and they pay into EI. If they get sick and so sick that they can no longer work, or injured, which is a super common thing to happen in an industrial slaughterhouse where you're working, doing repetitive, strain-oriented activities for 8 hours a day in very cold temperatures. Injuries are very common in this industry. So if you become injured and are no longer able to work, you leave the country and you do not actually access EI. So temporary foreign workers actually pay into systems that they are often not even eligible to access. I should also note that these temporary foreign workers we're talking about are not eligible for social housing, or what little social housing exists. They're not eligible, like I said, for EI if they lose their job. And so but they do pay into our healthcare and education system. The other thing that's important about these workers is the vast majority, the workers that I meet, and these are the low wage temporary foreign workers, do not have their families with them. And it is a program that many advocates and organizations and academics and others have been criticizing for decades because of it is highly vulnerable to exploitation. Workers are very disinclined to report unsafe conditions of work because their legal status is tied to their employer. Meaning, if they get fired, it's very hard for them to stay in Canada because of the way our temporary foreign worker program works. So they have to leave, but they also often are separated from their family. And so they have kids and spouses back in their country of origin, and they are often here on these 2-year work contracts. some hope and are able to access our provincial nominee program and become permanent residents. So in another way, they also kind of like do all of the the costs associated with like settlement. They don't access federally funded settlement services. They do that all themselves, right? Like to suggest they're a burden. So the point I want to emphasize here, just like one more little thing about meatpacking that's important, and I think reflects kind of the broader challenge in like specifically in Alberta and in general, is the meatpacking industry, which, as I said, is highly consolidated and run by these massive transnational corporations like Cargill and JBS, which I mentioned. Like, just for consolidation numbers, like 70% of the beef that is sold in Canada is produced at just these two plants. They operate 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and they like 20% of their workforce are temporary foreign workers. And that industry, like at an industry group level through the Meat Council of Canada and other like industry lobby groups, have like lobbied and pushed and continue to push for ever more temporary foreign workers. The data that they put out around labor shortages is that they are facing like catastrophic labor shortages. During COVID, the federal government created special pathways for these temporary foreign workers to come in despite border closures and no one getting in and out of the country. So the industry itself claims that they need these temporary foreign workers, and that's borne out in the data. So like 18 to 20% of all agricultural workers in Canada are temporary. So there needs to be, we should criticize the temporary foreign worker program. We should have major problems with the temporary foreign worker program. There's so much evidence about the ways in which it creates vulnerability and exploitation for these workers, to say nothing of just like, is this really who we want to be, where we ask people to just come and work in these really difficult, like high injury, low paid jobs and be separated from their families for years at a time? Like, is that the kind of immigration system we want to run? Moral and ethical question. But regardless of that, they are the cornerstone of this industry, and this is how our like food system functions. So either the industry needs to be encouraged to pay higher wages and offer better conditions of work, or they need to they will continue to pressure the government to allow them to hire temporary foreign workers. Like there is no option C for the labor shortage in this particular industry, as far as I can evaluate.
Why? I can imagine an answer to this, but why would Cargill and JBS not push back against the idea of fewer temporary foreign workers, or even making Alberta a less attractive place for TFWs?
Yeah, and I have yet to see them comment, and I would be very interested, because certainly there's like, so the cap, there's an industry cap on how many workers they're allowed to hire. And I also just want to like, just to touch on the referendum piece in the sense and like link it here. One of the questions says something like priority for Alberta workers. Albertans given first priority on new employment opportunities, right? So these firms do have to go through something called a labor market impact assessment, or a LMIA process, where they have to show that there are no local workers. And that is actually not, we can maybe take them at their word, because they have, in some of the analysis my colleague and I have done, they have like leveraged a predatory geography to move to places where there are few workers. So then they are able to say, like, we need temporary foreign workers because they are a preferred type of worker. So the number of workers that a meatpacking plant can hire at any time goes up and down. So like kind of before COVID, before the pandemic, it was around like 10% of your workforce could be temporary foreign workers. And then it went up to 20. And then in the kind of like 2021 era, it went up to 30% because there were labor shortages in the industry, because few people wanted to work, and also many people were disabled out of work during COVID. And so they raised the cap to 30%, and then they reduced it to 20%. And when the feds said, okay, no, not 30%, 20%, like the Western producer, not exactly like left-wing, hotbed of like migrant justice literature, quoted all of these, like the industry leaders saying like, this is outrageous. Like the headline is something like, beef packers slam changes to temporary foreign worker program. And because the Packers they wanted their 30%, they wanted to keep it. And so this is interesting because this puts we need to be asking how this coalition of business and political leadership actually sees where this would go if we make this a place where it is less desirable, so-called, for temporary foreign workers. The problem is then we're taking them at their word that this is actually what it is, when really what this referendum is not actually about, limiting the number of temporary foreign workers. It's about using temporary foreign workers and temporary migrants, so-called temporary, again, many of them do become permanent residents, but they absorb all these costs in the early years, and to blame them for these other social problems that we're facing, right? So I think I would be surprised. It will be interesting. It would be great if some people could maybe go and ask these leaders of industry about the particular proposals, but there isn't actually anything in this referendum questions that would fundamentally change the nature of the temporary foreign worker program. All it does is shift responsibility for things like healthcare costs directly onto temporary foreign workers who are paying taxes into our healthcare system right now.
Repeat that again, Bronwyn. Let's make sure that is on the record.
So the temporary foreign workers are paying taxes into our healthcare and education system. Mm-hmm. And many of them don't have children who are accessing our education system at present.
Because they're back in their country of origin. Right. Bronwyn, you mentioned the first question. I don't want to get into every single question because I think there's much more interesting things. But the very first one, do you support the government of Alberta taking increased control over immigration for the purpose of decreasing immigration to more sustainable levels, prioritizing economic migration, and ensuring Albertans have first priority to new employment opportunities? You kind of mentioned it in your last answer, but talk to us about that one specifically, the language of prioritizing economic migration.
Yeah, well, that's interesting because we do prioritize economic immigration. Employer-led immigration has been at the kind of heart of our immigration system for, this is probably disputable. People might go back and forth on the numbers, but let's say, at least 20 years. Our immigration numbers historically were 30%, 30%, 30% for different categories. So, sorry, let me back up. So in our permanent immigration stream, we have 3 categories: economic, humanitarian, family class. And currently, and for a long time, 60% of immigration is economic immigration. So these are your federal skilled workers. These are your many other different programs that fall under our economic immigration program, but those are economic. That is an economic immigration program. Our provincial nominee program falls under that, and our provincial nominee, so this is where the federal government gives different provinces kind of a certain number, which only 2 years ago, our premier was pushing the government to give us more provincial nominees, where the province gets to nominate particular migrants that they want to basically to move from the temporary to the permanent residence. So those might be some of the meatpacking folks I'm talking about. And those are economic immigrants. And then family class makes up about 20%. Those are your sponsored spouses, your parents and grandparents. And then 20% are refugees. Okay. So that's like how it breaks down. And so we can say like, we already prioritize economic immigration, one, but two, even those those family members and refugees also work. They are also employed. And the evidence is like that those folks are like just as absorbed into our labor market as our so-called economic immigrants. Okay. And this is like, just to like ground this in our reality. Like what I see is a lot of people critiquing immigration, or even on the kind of like center of our politics, sort of saying like, well, immigration's just gotten a little out of control. I think we can all agree, like housing and so forth. And okay. But like, if we go through our lives, and I say this as like a white lady with kids, I see, like, look at how our economy works. Like, when you drop your kids off at daycare, who's working in daycare? When you go to visit your family member in the senior's home, who's working in the senior's home? If you are in the emergency room waiting to like be seen by a doctor, who's cleaning that hospital floor? So those folks are in our economy. Resettled refugees are working and in our economy. Family members are like cleaning office buildings. They are doing jobs. So this idea that like, but also just if you just want to take her at her word, we do prioritize economic immigration. And the federal numbers are reproduced at the provincial level. So economic immigration is already already a priority. And Albertans is a very broad category here. We presume she means like Alberta citizens and permanent residents are given first priority for new employment opportunities. That is already how this system works. Like, yes, employers have, I believe, too much of a role. And I do believe the pressure to kind of like ever can expand our temporary foreign worker program is a problem, but there is a process whereby these employers have to prove I cannot find enough people to work at my business in X, Y, and Z industries. And so that process does exist. So Albertans already do have priority to new labor opportunities. And also sustainable levels, just, for the purposes of decreasing immigration. Okay, so maybe this was a plausible policy in 2023 when our immigration numbers were at like historic highs. And we can talk about why they were. And we can agree that the way that the kind of settlement infrastructure worked during that period was probably not sufficient. So it actually put a lot of newcomers in vulnerable positions. And I have a lot of criticisms of the Trudeau era program for that reason, but there was also a reason for it. But immigration, that was 2023. We're in 2026. Immigration levels, according to the Alberta government's own immigration data, are down year over year across both permanent and temporary migration streams. So they have already decreased. So also, this is just a little picky academic thing, but like there's 3 questions in this first question. And like, that's just bad question.
Okay, I said I wasn't going to do this for all. I want to talk about 2, but then we can talk about that language thing because you're an academic who spent years in this field, and it's like this is complicated, and there's a lot there. The average Albertan reading this and going to vote, do you support the government of Alberta taking increased control over immigration? Yes. You're not reading the rest of that. Let's just go to number 2, and then we don't need to go through every single one. But 1 leads to 2, which is, do you support the government of Alberta introducing a law mandating only Canadian citizens, permanent residents, and individuals with an Alberta-approved immigration status will be eligible for provincially funded programs such as health, education, and other social services? Pick apart this one for us.
Okay, well, this one is the one that like makes my heart, like I feel like my heart, my blood pressure goes up or whatever. Like this is a difficult one because there is no such thing as an Alberta approved immigration status. Okay. So, and I think this is like, to be clear, I think and you all are the politics people, so you would have a better handle on this. But I think that this is kind of the effort to politicize, right? Because the idea is like Alberta wants its own immigration system, but immigration is a federal matter. So it is a federal matter. So we do not have, so if I were a voter, or I am a voter, but if I was looking at this, the question I have is like, what does it mean to have an Alberta approved immigration status? So that is a confusing piece. Okay. So introducing a law that only citizens and PRs, permanent residents, and Alberta approved immigration status are eligible for provincially funded programs. Okay. So as I mentioned earlier, currently, the current system is that only Canadian citizens and permanent residents have access to the majority of our provincially funded programs. So those would be like, again, what little like social housing is available. The last time I looked, the wait list for Calgary housing was like 4,000 people long. But your temporary residents, your temporary foreign workers, your international students, and your refugee claimants do not have access to those social programs. those same people also don't have access to this quote unquote other social services. I assume that means like Alberta Works, like income support, but I don't know because they're not articulated. They don't have access to those either. Okay, so then healthcare and education. So again, presuming that we're talking about people here who are on a temporary status, the last time I checked, there's about 280,000 people in the province who are classified as non-permanent residents. So that's like 5.5% of our population. So of those, we have basically 4 categories in our NPRs. We have temporary foreign workers, who I've talked about at length. We have international students. Those numbers are really down, like very, very low, very hard to get an international student visa right now. And visitors. So that's your like friend from the UK who's coming to look at Lake Louise, and our refugee claimants. So visitors we can just take off because visitors don't have access to anything. Visitors don't have access to healthcare. So visitors not on the table. Claimants are people who make a refugee claim in Canada. They are a small percentage of our overall refugee population. When people say like, oh, it's the refugees who are using all the healthcare and education, most of our refugees are permanent residents. Okay, so they don't count in question 2 because according to this question, citizens and permanent residents and Alberta approved immigration status have access to that. So we're not talking about most of our refugees, but let's say we're talking about refugee claimants. So that would be like a person who's here who is somehow already in Alberta and they make a refugee claim. Those folks represent less than 10% of our non-permanent resident population. So we're talking really small numbers.
And 10% of the 5.5%?
Yeah, 10% of the 280,000 people, give or take.
Yeah.
It's a small number. But those people, once you make a refugee claim in Canada, you also don't access Alberta Health through, like, you can access healthcare, but it is paid for by something called the Interim Federal Health Program. So refugee claimants get their healthcare paid for by the federal government. So we're not talking about refugee claimants. Okay, so now we're back to, again, who are these people? Okay, so they're the temporary foreign workers and they're the international students. And again, like a relatively small number of people, but even if we say that's like, those too many, or they should pay, they are paying because most of them are paying taxes through their work. If you're a temporary foreign worker, you're paying taxes. Sorry, this is just me yelling about temporary foreign workers paying taxes, but they are paying into our healthcare and education system. Also, our international students, they're paying like exorbitant tuition. Sorry, University of Lethbridge, but they are paying exorbitant tuition. And frankly, they've been like a major funding stream for universities. So we should be critiquing and thinking about the problems with the international student program for sure. Cutting them off does not seem to me to be the most prudent plan for future, but that's maybe a separate issue. But also, most of our international students are also have a work permit. So they are also working. They are also paying taxes in addition to going to school. And I see that because I have these students in my class and most of them are working.
Notoriously, the hours they are permitted to work has gone up to the point where work is affecting studies and their ability to actually perform in university. Right.
Yes. Also, arguably, our international student population is probably not like among the heaviest users of our healthcare system.
Those sick 20-somethings.
Those they're just, I actually don't think that is a very good way of like looking at healthcare use because it's, there's real problems with that. But in general, we're talking about a small group of people who are, most of whom are working and paying taxes, but also their healthcare dollars. Also, they're like, how many kids do they have in school? Like maybe like there are international students who have families, but it's like not the majority. So again, this question is very difficult to answer, but B, just leads the perception that there is this like out of control number of people who are currently accessing our healthcare, education, and social service programs and not paying for them. And that is just not true.
Appreciate the yelling. It needs to, don't apologize for it. It needs to happen. We just had how many minutes of conversation on number 2 to get to the point that like, it is not correct. I don't know, Leah, if you want to jump in here. But you're presenting these questions from the political angle. You're presenting these questions to Albertans that are not necessarily true. Like I think the average person is going to look and say, if they believe this, immigrants equal bad. Yes, 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 yes. Right? Like, I don't know, Bronwyn, how much does that pain you, and what do you think can be done? And Leah, if you have ideas as well.
I more have a rant. I mean, it's this ultra nationalist project that we see conservative forces executing all across the world. We see it in the States, in tragic display. So, we hear Albertans first. We're hearing language coming out of a senior staffer in the Premier's office talking about people coming here as importing from failed nations, language like Judeo-Christian heritage. It's like a fucking IKEA instruction manual on a nationalist project that is designed to create an other. So to Bronwyn's earlier point, it is true that housing is increasingly unaffordable and insecure for a lot of people across the country. It is true that life is more expensive than, every single day it gets more and more expensive. Most people haven't experienced these kinds of inflationary pressures before. It is true that, the job market for young people is really tough, and that affects both young people and their parents who are worried about their kids' future. There's a lot going on, and it's so simple and easy to find a brown community that you can place all of that on, while as a government, you refuse to fund education, to fund healthcare, to properly fund social services for the rest of the population. But if we just make sure that we're pointing over to this very visible group of people that we can use to blame for the hardships that you're facing, then we don't have to wear any of the responsibility for that. And it functions as this larger project where we see defining of a cultural core, which is sort of inherently white and Canadian and English speaking. Then there is a suggestion that a demographic change or new people will threaten these traditions or this quote unquote civilization. Then it's easy to frame any type of move to protect that as common sense and virtuous. And we see these play out where people are dying in the streets in the United States.
Yeah.
And it starts with moments exactly like this. They never mention race outright. It's very coded. It's very quote unquote defensible. Danielle Smith's superpower is saying things that sound reasonable while spewing white nationalist bullshit hatred like this that will have really, really dangerous consequences in communities all across Alberta and the country.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And I this is where the joking about the anger, but it's like this is happening, we're all paying attention. Well, we are all paying attention to what's happening in the United States. And it's like this, it starts with this kind of rhetoric, and it ends with people getting shot on the street in Minneapolis. And I know that sounds hyperbolic and extreme, but if we do not call this what it is and call it out, there are real vulnerabilities. So I talked about Brooks as this multicultural success, and that's often how it positions itself. But also my folks there that I work closely with in community are sending me screenshots of graffiti that say "Make Brooks White Again." And that is when you think then there are little kids, there are little black and brown kids who are going to school, and they have white students peers, and who's hearing what at home, who's hearing what around the kitchen table, what kind of treatment are folks getting as they go through their daily lives, as they're driving, as they're buying, going to the grocery store. Already levels of hate crime are up and underreported. And so for the most politically powerful person in our province to go out and just say let's just have a public discussion about immigration, and it's direct democracy about a topic that people are famously really good at talking in nuanced and complex ways about. And granted, the immigration system is very complicated, and I I recognize that like not everybody should have to have this like super high level to be involved in conversations about what their community looks like and who is there and how does that work. But what people don't realize, and this is what we've also seen in the States, is as soon as the actual deportation and removal regime comes in, people are like, oh, no, like I meant immigrants. I didn't mean like that lady that runs my corner store. I didn't mean my childcare worker. I didn't mean the nurse in my who's been so nice to my dad. Like people want to talk about immigrants, meaning racialized people who some imagine, and because they are being told that they are using up all of our social services. And
I think there's this imagined category called immigrants that is largely racialized, manufactured. Like this doesn't actually exist, because when people actually start to lose the people in their community who they realize they actually have relationships with, like maybe they don't hang out, but they're like, oh, I really depend on you to take care of my kid or my senior. Because again, care work, super heavy reliance on racialized labor, mostly immigrant women, a lot of temporary foreign workers, and they're crucial to our social safety net. But once those people start disappearing from community, which is what has happened in the US, people start to get like quite upset because they think like, I agree there's too much immigration, but don't take the people that I know and care about or who I rely on for my basic needs and family's well-being to leave. And so I think that is like why, to Leah's point earlier, like we need to be so careful, and like why the anger needs to happen right now or like in the coming months to say like, this is not acceptable. This is not who we want to be. But I would also say we need we need some political organization, because again, this can't just fall on like community groups and angry academics to push it. We need a political response that is, again, addressing some of the like core fundamental challenges that people are facing in the economy, and also really clearly articulates why this is dangerous and why that's not who we want to be. This is not who we want to be. We actually care about our diverse and like stronger together kind of community that we are part of. And then we are actually all dependent on each other for this, you know?
I think that's what makes these conversations so hard sometimes, is that, one, because they're framed as kind of like ludicrous, like the sentences barely make sense. There's 3 questions packed into one. They're sort of rambly run-on sentences. They include terms that don't really exist. That it's a bit of a trap for us to go in there and want to edit the questions, debate the terminology. Then the fact checking, where, that's the well actually phase where we talk about the different types of immigrants and the fact that I love it. They pay taxes. Yes, we can keep repeating that. That is true. But it's too easy to get pulled into that type of a frame. And it misses that fundamental point that you're making about who we want to be. And I remember in my undergrad, one of the most pivotal debates I ever had was you might remember this setup better than me. This is now 20 years ago. But, it was, do we want universal health care that pays for the millionaire and the unemployed? Or ought there be, some type of means testing? So the answer gets you into different partisan ideologies, but ultimately we chose as a country that everyone gets it, that it is an equalizer, that something as basic and fundamental as the right to health care is universally applied, regardless of income or any other factor. And that question remains when we start talking about this. And I want to see the conversation shift to not just how newcomers and immigrants fit in as economic widgets, but also what they offer communities. The point you were making at the beginning with a risk to community cohesion, like the diversity, the culture, the richness, the beauty that is added to this country by welcoming people in, aside from the economic benefits, is a conversation that will be missed entirely by a set of questions like this.
I totally agree. And I also think so then it's incumbent on like all of us to kind of think about like, how do we tell that story? And how do we, I guess the collective we, but also like our political leadership, because we do fall too often into this kind of like neoliberal trap of like, but they're good for the economy. And like, I've probably been screaming that for the last like 45 minutes. They are. Immigration is good for the economy. Our current labor market, or labor force replacement, like people exiting the workforce versus people going in, right? We're losing 100 workers. We're only replacing them at 65 people, right? So we've got to have like a solution. Our fertility is low. I know there's certain parts of our our far right community who have a solution for that is alarming. But if like we do need immigration for economic reasons, but more importantly than that, the vast majority of folks that are in this country are here as uninvited guests, have a history of immigration, and the chances are highly likely that that your grandparents or extended grandparents came here without speaking English, worked in some kind of agriculture, did backbreaking labor in difficult jobs. And this is not to say that is acceptable today. It is not. This is 2026. We can do better. But the fact is, like, we have that history and we've built this place on that. And to just kind of now use that to really marginalize and ostracize a particular group of people is to ignore a more positive story that we could be telling, like that we could actually be building a better community together.
But Bronwyn, those were white people largely.
Yes. And actually they were, because our immigration system has a very problematic racial history, which is a story for another day. And that is true. But also, like, I think we all have heard these stories, right? Like even particular groups of immigrants within that white population were always treated as like, there was always groups within that. We also have a long history of racialized people building this country, from Japanese migrants to like Chinese workers on the railway. Like we have the oldest mosque in the country in Edmonton. Like that's the other thing that's like importing non-Judeo-Christian. Like we have such a long history of Muslim settlement in this province, and we should be proud of that history, and we should be celebrating that history, and we should be seeing that. Like when I was a little kid growing up in Alberta, there's this little postcard from like Alberta Human Rights that they would put out with like 3 little babies. And it said that we're like...
You say free babies?
3 babies.
Okay.
Oh yeah, free babies would be a real Alberta vibe for sure. No, 3 little babies, and they were all like, they were racially different, right? And it said like, Alberta, our diversity is our strength. And I remember that as a little kid. And not that like such a cheesy thing to say now, but really like to suggest that this is some like place that has only a Judeo-Christian heritage of like white history, like, is to erase the kind of really important and beautiful histories that we have here. Also our dark histories of like of racialized migration programs and settler colonialism. But we need to like bring all of this together to say, like, what do we actually want to be in the future? We need immigration for economic reasons, but we may also want it because it is like a net benefit to our collective community. And that needs to get at like feelings and heart and pull people into this conversation, because I completely agree. Like actually, you don't really understand how the temporary foreign worker program works isn't going to move folks.
But when I'm just looking at the time, we could chat for another couple hours, but we won't. I like to try to leave listeners with like something a little bit hopeful or an action that they can do. I think you mentioned the little kids in Brooks, and not just Brooks, like across Alberta, right? The little kids who were hearing conversations about this, not just the little kids, the teenagers, the people in their 20s, right? Like, short of people listening voting no on these referendum questions, do you have any advice for actions or conversations? I would say share this podcast with your circles for some people, but do you, amongst your circles, amongst the people in community that you're talking to, like what are the actions that people need to do? I think calling it out is a great first step, and we're so thankful that you came on this podcast and are offering your expertise. But like, what can people who are listening to this, who are yelling alongside, who are agreeing, what can they do?
That's a great question. I always joke with my students that I'm like the critical human geographer. So like hope isn't like really where I live. But I think the point of action is good. And I do think as much as people can educate themselves about the immigration system, there are some really worthwhile organizations to look out for, I would say Migrante Alberta, the International Migrants Alliance, which is based in Edmonton. So if you're want to be engaged with groups that are doing things, those are two that I can think of. And there is more stuff happening, but organizing is long and hard. It's joyful and fun. And there is stuff that will be coming out further. So I would say stay tuned for that. But, a migrant rights activist that I've worked with for a long time, Nellie Alcaraz, I'll just shout her out. She's with Migrante. She's amazing. And she's come and talked to my class. And the advice that she gives students that I think is so worthwhile is just to start paying attention to the people that you interact with in your everyday life and recognize that many of those folks might be temporary foreign workers. They might be here without their families. They may have hopes and dreams related to becoming part of this country. They may be experiencing really difficult conditions of work, and treat them like a human being and interact with them in a way that has some empathy and just relationality. You're a person and I'm a person, instead of treating them like a service person, like the DoorDash guy or the Tim Hortons server, and understand that we actually have a lot more in common, and that overall we are part of an economic system that is deeply exploitive and problematic, and we need to work together to change that system. It's not that guy's fault that whatever economic struggles you might be having. So I think that to me was a really helpful thing. It's just for people to be attentive. When we're talking about immigration, you're actually talking about people who live in your community, and just try to be, and I know probably your listeners already are there, but short of joining some of the work that's going to be happening going forward, I think just being mindful of how we live in community and talk to each other is probably a good way to go.
Listeners are perfect, but this will give them good language and advice as they talk to their less perfect friends and family members.
Yeah, and thinking about the people is what it all comes back to, what politics comes back to. So let's end it on that note. Thank you so much for joining us on Balance of Power today, Bronwyn.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
You've been listening to Balance of Power Pod. You can reach us at suggestionbox@balanceofpowerpod.ca. We always want to hear what you have to say. Our tech production is by Haxum. Our content production assistant is Sydney Whiting. And our music is by Shayla Miller.